Pearl Harbor from the Japanese Perspective. December 6, 1941. Hitokapu Bay, Kuril Islands. Lieutenant Zenji Abbe stood on the frozen deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching his breath form clouds in the Arctic air. In his leather flying jacket pocket, pressed against his chest, lay a farewell letter to his wife and a lock of his hair for his funeral. He had written the final words that morning, "If I do not return, know that I served with honor." But somewhere in the back of his mind, a question gnawed that he dared not speak aloud. The Americans we are about to attack, are they truly the weakened nation our commanders promised? 24 hours later, that question would begin to find its answer in the most devastating way possible. What the Japanese pilots discovered after Pearl Harbor would not be measured in sunken ships or destroyed aircraft, but in a far more terrifying realization. They had not crippled a declining power. They had awakened an industrial colossus that would bury them in steel, aircraft, and ships at a rate that defied comprehension. This is the story of Pearl Harbor from the Japanese perspective, a tale not of military triumph, but of a nation's gradual, horrifying discovery that they had challenged an enemy whose industrial capacity was not just superior, but incomprehensible. The path to Pearl Harbor had been paved with desperation, not confidence. In July 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in America and imposed a total oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch East Indies followed immediately. In a single stroke, Japan lost access to 80% of its petroleum supply. The empire's oil reserves, carefully stockpiled over years, would last perhaps 18 months. If war came, that timeline collapsed to less than a year. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, understood what many of his fellow officers refused to accept. He had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He had walked American streets, visited American factories, seen American abundance firsthand. In January 1941, he wrote a letter warning of the consequences of war with America. Should hostilities break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines or even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. I wonder if our politicians have confidence as to the final outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices. He knew this was impossible. But Yamamoto was a patriot, and when his nation chose war, he would plan the attack. His strategy was brutal in its clarity. Strike the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor with overwhelming force. Sink the battleships. Destroy the aircraft on the ground. Buy time, perhaps 6 months, perhaps a year, for Japan to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya, the resources needed for survival, then negotiate peace from a position of strength before American industrial production could mobilize. It was a gambler's strategy from a man with a gambler's heart. And like most gamblers, he would lose. The first air fleet departed Hitokapu Bay on November 26, 1941. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 7 fuel tankers, and 3 submarines. 414 aircraft aboard the carriers, representing the finest naval aviators in the world. They maintained absolute radio silence for the entire 3,500-mile journey across the North Pacific. The northern route, through waters ravaged by winter storms, was chosen specifically because it was rarely traveled. American reconnaissance aircraft would not be searching these freezing seas. The fleet reached its launch position 230 miles north of Oahu at 0600 hours on December 7, 1941. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, leading the first wave of 183 aircraft, lifted off from Akagi's flight deck as dawn broke across the Pacific. 4 months, the pilots had trained over Kagoshima Bay, chosen because its geography mirrored Pearl Harbor. Mountains dropping to a shallow harbor, requiring precision approaches at extremely low altitude. The torpedo bombers had practiced releasing their weapons at altitudes of just 10 to 20 meters above the water. The torpedoes were designed to run at depths of 10 meters below the surface instead of the standard deeper depths that would strike the harbor bottom. One pilot, Kaname Harada, assigned to carrier Soryu, had sent his pregnant wife back to her family home in Nagano in September when training intensified. Following Japanese custom, neither showed emotion at their goodbye, though she wrote to him daily until the ship departed. At 0740 hours Hawaiian time, Fukuda's formation spotted the installations at Pearl Harbor spread below them. The harbor was crowded with ships. 8 battleships moored along Battleship Row. The fleet was in port exactly as intelligence had predicted. But something was wrong. Something crucial. The 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not present. They were at sea, their locations unknown. Fukuda made his decision in seconds. The attack would proceed. He slid back the canopy of his Nakajima B-5N2 and fired a single dark blue flare, the signal his pilots had trained for months to recognize. Then he transmitted 3 words that would echo through history: Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. Complete surprise achieved. The attack lasted 1 hour and 15 minutes across 2 waves. 2,403 Americans died. 1,170 were wounded. 2 battleships, Arizona and Oklahoma, became total losses that would never return to service. For more battleships, West Virginia, California, Nevada, and Tennessee suffered severe damage but would eventually be salvaged and repaired. 188 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 64 men. By any conventional military measure, it was an extraordinary success. But as the Japanese pilots circled above the smoking harbor, preparing to return to their carriers, some observed details that would later haunt them. The massive oil storage tanks on the shore, holding millions of gallons of fuel, sat untouched. The submarine base was intact. The repair facilities were undamaged. The dry docks remained operational. And those 3 carriers were still out there somewhere in the Pacific, untouched and lethal. Lieutenant Zenji Abbe flew in the second wave, piloting an Aichi D-3A dive bomber. By the time his formation arrived over Pearl Harbor, the Arizona was already a burning wreck, her forward magazines detonated by a bomb from the first wave that killed 1,177 men in a single catastrophic explosion. Abbe targeted ships still capable of fighting, adding his bombs to the destruction already underway. The question that had gnawed at him on the frozen deck of Akagi found no answer in the smoke and fire below, only more questions. Aboard Akagi, Commander Fukuda urged Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo to launch a 3rd wave to return and destroy the fuel tanks and repair facilities. Nagumo refused. The 1st Air Fleet had achieved its objective. The element of surprise was lost. American forces were now fully alert. The carriers must withdraw before the American carriers found them. The decision was tactically sound and strategically catastrophic. The ships that Japan had damaged would be raised. The aircraft would be replaced. But that choice to leave the infrastructure intact would allow Pearl Harbor to remain operational as the forward base for the entire Pacific Fleet throughout the war. As the Japanese fleet steamed back toward home waters, the pilots began to process what they had witnessed. Yes, they had sunk battleships. Yes, they had achieved surprise. But the American base they had attacked revealed something deeply troubling. The scale of Pearl Harbor's facilities, the number of ships present, the infrastructure visible even from their attack altitude, all suggested an industrial capacity far beyond what Japanese intelligence had described. If this was just one American base, how many more existed? The question would be answered with brutal mathematical precision over the following months. In 1941, Japan had produced 5,088 aircraft. The United States had produced 19,433, nearly 4 times more. In 1942, as Japan struggled to replace the 4 carriers lost at Midway in June, the United States commissioned USS Essex, the first of a class that would eventually number 24 ships. Japan entered the war with 10 carriers. After Midway, it would never operate more than 6 simultaneously again. The numbers grew more devastating with each passing year. By 1943, American factories were producing approximately 8,000 to 9,000 aircraft per month. Japanese production for the entire year reached 16,000. The United States produced more in 2 months than Japan managed in 12. The SS Robert E. Peary, a Liberty ship, was constructed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The keel was laid at 1 minute past midnight on November 8, 1942. The ship launched on November 12. While this was a publicity demonstration and normal production averaged 42 to 50 days, by 1943, American shipyards were completing 3 Liberty ships every 2 days. In the first 4 months of 1943 alone, American yards launched more merchant tonnage than Japan had built in 7 years of war preparation. The aircraft production gap was equally devastating. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, operated by Ford Motor Company, produced B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 every 63 minutes, 24 hours per day. Each bomber contained 1,550,000 parts. American workers assembled them faster than Japanese factories could produce fighters to defend against them. By late 1943, Japanese pilots were beginning to encounter a phenomenon that their training had not prepared them for: American forces operating with seemingly unlimited resources. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Task Force 58 brought together 15 American carriers and 900 aircraft, launching strikes that Japanese defenses simply could not match. The Japanese aircraft that opposed them, many flown by hastily trained replacement pilots following the catastrophic losses at Midway and subsequent battles, were slaughtered in what American pilots grimly nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost between 350 and 600 aircraft, and 2 more carriers. The American industrial machine was now operating at a pace that made Japanese resistance mathematically impossible. The pilots who survived long enough to witness this transformation faced a psychological devastation as complete as any physical defeat. Japanese pilots wrote home in growing despair after Midway. "Where are all these aircraft coming from? We shoot them down and the sky fills with replacements. This is industrial annihilation." By 1945, Japan's situation had become hopeless. The oil supplies captured in the Dutch East Indies could not reach Japanese refineries. American submarines, produced at a rate Japanese shipyards could never match, had effectively severed the supply lines. Oil tankers lay on the ocean floor by the hundreds. Japan's navy, once the 3rd largest in the world, was reduced to harbor defense. The elite pilots who had trained at Kagoshima Bay, who had achieved complete surprise at Pearl Harbor, were mostly dead, replaced by boys with months of training instead of years. Some were sent on one-way missions, kamikaze attacks, the final admission that conventional naval aviation could no longer compete. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were almost redundant. Japan's industrial capacity was already destroyed, its cities burned by conventional bombing, its navy gone, its air force reduced to suicide attacks. The empire that had struck at Pearl Harbor, believing 6 months of victories would force a negotiated peace, had instead triggered the full mobilization of an industrial power that produced at rates beyond Japanese comprehension. America built 297,000 aircraft during the war, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. Japan's entire war production across all categories represented less than 10% of American output in most cases, less than 5% in many. Admiral Yamamoto had been proven tragically correct. After 6 months, we will have utterly no confidence. He died on April 18, 1943, when American fighters, guided by intercepted and decoded messages from the JN-25B code revealing his inspection tour itinerary, ambushed his transport aircraft over Bougainville. He did not live to see the full scale of the catastrophe his attack on Pearl Harbor had unleashed. But he had known from the beginning. He had walked American streets, seen American factories, understood American capacity. His final gamble had been that spirit and skill might overcome industrial supremacy. He was wrong. The Japanese pilots who survived the war, including Lieutenant Zenji Abbe and others who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack, would spend decades processing what they had witnessed. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a brilliant tactical success that guaranteed strategic defeat. They had not struck a weak, unprepared enemy. They had struck a sleeping giant that, once awakened, possessed industrial power beyond anything they had imagined possible. The oil embargo that pushed Japan toward war had been intended to prevent Japanese expansion. Instead, it triggered a conflict that revealed the true hierarchy of global industrial power. Japan, which had modernized in merely 50 years and become a regional power, had challenged a nation with 17 times its gross national income, 5 times its steel production, and twice its population. The outcome was never in doubt once American production fully mobilized. American industrial might accomplish what Yamamoto had feared most, not through superior strategy or tactical brilliance, though both played roles, but through simple, overwhelming, relentless production. American factories built ships faster than they could be sunk. American industry produced aircraft faster than they could be shot down. American shipyards, aircraft plants, tank factories, and supply chains operated at a scale that rendered Japanese resistance increasingly futile with each passing month. By the time Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the nation that had struck at Pearl Harbor in 1941 had been comprehensively defeated, not by American fighting spirit alone, but by American industrial capacity, operating at percentages of global output that Japan could never match. The pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor had awakened a giant, and that giant had buried them in steel.